Welcome, everybody. It's great that you can all attend. It's wonderful seeing everybody arriving. I wish we were all in person, of course, but this, as the first of our spring lecture series, it turns out that it's a truly global Joycean experience, which could never, of course, have happened if we were still in the James Joyce Centre. So, in some ways, this is so exciting to welcome visitors from the US and Peru and New Zealand and Canada and Russia and Galway and of course a few residents of dear dirty Dublin. I'll just wait until we're bang on 8 o'clock, I think, to start. I can't believe you're all so prompt turning up. Um, it's very exciting that this can happen, and it took us a while to get our lecture series up and running. So I'm really delighted that we could start tonight with Senan Molony and his talk, Martha Clifford Unveiled. Uh, his description is most intriguing as one of the longest running parlour games in literature, akin to the hunt of Shakespeare's Dark Lady. Joyce in Ulysses tells us to find MC, the pseudonymous letter partner of Leopold Bloom, posing as Henry Flower. Senan Molony argues we have to think outside the books for a solution to this Clifford conundrum. So a little bit about Senan Molony. He is an award-winning journalist, and he describes himself as a self-described non-conforming Joycean. And I think a few people have said that that's their favorite type of Joycean, a non-conforming one. So we'll see about that tonight, how conforming you are, Senan. He's described as giving a series of Bloomsday talks in the Leeson Lounge and at the Trieste Summer School, and of course with us here at the James Joyce Centre. He says he still hasn't slogged his way through Finnegan's Wake. Okay, which always needed a fearless editor. But we've been lucky enough in the James Joyce Centre and the Joyceborough reading groups to have performed a few of his plays based on Ulysses as well, and they were lots of fun. We did Bust Up at Barney's, which was based on Barney Kiernan's pub, Blumeus, and most recently Child's Play, which was based on the child's murder that appears in Ulysses. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the talk, so if you'd like to write any questions into the chat box, I'll ask him some very difficult questions at the end, just to test our non-conforming Joycean. Before we start, though, if you wouldn't mind, I would just like to pay tribute to my friend and the chair of the James Joyce Society of Denmark, John Christensen, who sadly passed away last week. And I know there's some of the James Joyce Society of Denmark with us tonight, and I'd really like to welcome you all. It's been a sad week losing John, and he has been in our thoughts since we heard the sad news. And with the help of Inga Jacobsen, she sent me a few words about the James Joyce Society of Denmark and its foundations, which I hadn't realised back in the early days, that Ulysses was already translated into Danish by 1949, and as early as the 50s, literary gatherings were taking place and discussions around Ulysses were taking place in Copenhagen. But they did say that Guinness was helping proceedings. The official foundation of the society was on Bloomsday in 1962 in northern Copenhagen, and the first president was Tom Christensen. And his work, Havoc, was heavily influenced by Ulysses. Tom Christensen had already written essays about Joyce in Copenhagen in newspapers as early as 1931, and Joyce knew of these before he and Nora met with Tom Christensen on their visit to Copenhagen in August 1936. And as chairman and president of the James Joyce Society of Copenhagen, John Christensen was an organizer and really a missionary of Joyce, getting people to read Ulysses, getting them to, inspiring them to not be afraid of these great works and find all the fun of them. He gave lectures on Joyce in public libraries and getting people starting reading groups, even Senan of Finnegan's Wake. And I was lucky enough to be invited to Denmark to perform for this wonderful society. And I think tonight, in this global celebration of Joyce, and I know so many of you are involved in reading groups internationally and Joyce societies, that John would really have loved this special occasion that we can all come together. He was such an optimistic and charismatic person, and really of course, Annette and his family were his love, but I think Ireland was also a little piece of his heart also. So for John, I'd like to sing my favorite Martha song from Ulysses. Well, like Simon Dedalus, I'll endeavour to get it out in bits. As Simon Dedalus says in the Sirens episode of Ulysses, "Ladies and gentlemen, I am most deeply obliged by your kind solicitations. I have no money, but if you will lend me your attention, I shall endeavour to sing to you of a heart bowed down." So this is to inspire us for our Martha Clifford. When first I saw that form endearing, sorrow from me seemed to depart. Each graceful look, each word so cheering, charmed my eye and won my heart. Full of hope and all delighted, none could feel more blessed than I. All on earth I then could wish for was near her to live and die. But alas, 'twas idle dreaming, and the dream too soon hath flown. Not one ray of hope was gleaming. I am lost, yes, I am lost, for she is gone. When first I saw that form endearing, sorrow from me seemed to depart. Each graceful look, each word so cheering, charmed my eye and won my heart. Martha, Martha, I am sighing, I am weeping still for thee. Come, thou lost one, come, thou dear one, thou alone canst comfort me. Ah, Martha, return, come to me. On that note, Senan Molony, I will pass you over and we shall start Martha Clifford Unveiled.
My goodness, what a fantastic performance, Darina. I hadn't expected that. And as the man says, now follow that. That was the English language version of Floto's Martha, also known as Mapari, which of course features in the great book. Right, I'm just going to plunge straight in. Welcome everybody. Leopold Bloom arrives home to Eccles Street at the end of Ulysses and pops a letter into a hiding place, there to join 3 other letters, all clandestine correspondence from a Martha Clifford. Bloom has been posing as Henry Flower in their pseudonymous exchanges. And now it is that James Joyce challenges his readers, writing in parentheses in Ithaca, find MC. Thus has begun one of the longest running parlour games in literature, as Dorina says, akin to the hunt for Shakespeare's Dark Lady of the Sonnets. And it may be no coincidence that Joyce refers to that Dark Lady in a bit about Bloom's wife, Molly, playing tarot in her bedroom. Molly Bloom, and all other female characters in Ulysses indeed, have been exhaustively assessed as candidates for Martha Clifford over the years. What few have done yet is to look outside the book. Of course, there is Martha Fleischmann, the girl Joyce became smitten with in Trieste and to whom he wrote letters, but that was in 1918. Martha Clifford material had already been published in the Little Review as extracts from Ulysses before Joyce ever set eyes on Fleischmann. Thus, Joyce turned that brief imbroglio in Trieste into a case of his own life, imitating his own art. So tonight I want to look through the real life prism, another one, and that is the one that's offered by the name of Henry Flower, which is itself a factual exterior allusion. There he is. In 1900, a policeman named Henry Flower came under extreme suspicion in what was called the Dodder mystery. Constable Flower was claimed to have been out walking with a servant girl named Bridget Gannon, who was found drowned in the River Dodder the following morning. The phrase "found drowned," of course, litters the pages of Ulysses. It was a common enough inquest verdict, and that was the finding with Bridget Gannon. It was delivered before she was even identified. The remains of Bridget, as we see here, were buried in Glasnevin as a Jane Doe, an unknown female. And then the news broke that the body had been identified before her anonymous burial. A female friend had viewed the body at the morgue and pronounced it to be that of Gannon, who had gone missing. The informant, importantly, didn't say anything further at this point. It was only the following morning that the woman sought out a policeman and told him that Constable Henry Flower had been in Gannon's company on the night she died. This was a sensational development. As it says in the Hades episode of Ulysses, the body to be exhumed, murder will out. The original doctor to examine the remains of Bridget Gannon found no marks consistent with violence, and nor did two other medics who examined the body on its subsequent exhumation. But a furore had arisen, and for two reasons. In the first place, Constable Henry Flower was one of the police officers who had taken the body from the river, and he didn't say a good word, good, bad, or indifferent, as it says in Eumaeus, when a sergeant who was present asked if any onlooker could identify the victim. Flower was right there and didn't say a word. He also accompanied the body to the morgue and peered at it once or twice under its covering. Secondly, once the dead woman's friend had made her accusation that Henry Flower was the last person seen in Gannon's company, his fellow officers naturally confronted the constable. Flower denied absolutely that he knew the dead woman, or that he had ever seen his accuser before either. That complainant was named Margaret Clowry. Is she the MC that readers are asked to find in Ulysses? We shall examine the evidence. Henry Flower remained silent at the second inquest, the original having been quashed in what was a legal precedent in Ireland. But Margaret Clowry told a story of how she accompanied Gannon, the dead woman, to a meeting with Constable Flower, who, she said pointedly, had, quote, pushed his friendship on her, that is, on Gannon. At one point in their perambulation, the two women entered a fruit shop, with Flower staying outside, and they bought what was to be Gannon's last meal, plums. The presence of plums in the stomach of the Jane Doe was identified at the first inquest before her name was known. And here, of course, we note that plum eating and plum eating women feature in the parable of the plums in Ulysses. Later on their walk, meanwhile, said Margaret Clowry, the constable asked her whether she had to leave, adding, "Can you take a broad hint?" Clowry thus concluded that 2 was company, but 3 a crowd, and she departed. She never saw Bridget Gannon alive again. A railway signalman named Patrick Riley, who we see here, later testified that he recognized Flower and a tall girl passing the level crossing at Lansdowne Road, about 400 yards from where the body would subsequently be found in the Dodder, in the eastern shadow of what is now the Aviva Stadium. The remains were discovered just 123 yards from the entrance to Newbridge Avenue, a famous address in Ulysses, the starting point for the funeral of Paddy Dignam. Meanwhile, another witness noticed 2 separate courting couples on the eastern bank of the Dodder that night. This witness was a postman who was later met by Margaret Clowry herself when she was out looking for Bridget Gannon. In the statement that Clowry gave to the police, she said that the postman had referred to the male partner in one of the couples who were canoodling on the bank of the Dodder as being, quote, "a big stout man like a gent, and still I thought he was a policeman, with a fat face, blue eyes, and fair moustache." This is a near perfect description of Flower, whose photograph you saw at the beginning, who was indeed a big stout man, a policeman with a fat face, blue eyes, and a fair moustache. The trouble was that the postman testified that he never told Clowry any such thing. He said that he could not identify the man, nor had he given any such detailed description to Clowry. Far from seeing a fair moustache and blue eyes, etc., the night was very dark and he could not even identify anyone's clothing. The witness, the postman, said he might have said to her that the girl wore a light dress, or a light blouse, I should say, which was as much as he allowed. So while Margaret Clowry put words into the postman's mouth, this initially went a begging. Meanwhile, she was brought by him to the spot where the postman saw the couple, which was near to where the body was found. And there, Margaret Clowry discovered the shredded remains of a flower. This had been spotted by a police sergeant when the corpse was taken from the river, but that officer had left it where it was. Clowry said the shredded remains were the flower which Gannon had pinned to her dress when going out that night, the night she died. And so its being pulled off was a possible sign of assault on the victim prior to Gannon entering the water. Things now worsened for Flower when a fellow constable named Dockery said that he and Flower had met Clowry and Gannon 3 days before the fatal night, and they had all walked out together. So while Flower denied knowing either of the women, either Gannon or Clowry, he had been in the company of both, and some 72 hours before Bridget Gannon died at the young age of 28. Henry Flower said in his police statement that he had been walking about Sandymount on the night of the drowning. Had never been with Clowry or even Bridget Gannon. And at 10 p.m, he had entered a pub at the end of Bath Street, close to his barracks at Irishtown. So in other words, he'd been somewhere else entirely. This is his barracks here, and he was never out with Bridget Gannon. He was vouched for by 2 police colleagues who were already drinking in that pub, and also by the owner of the premises. And all this was within half an hour of when it was suggested that Bridget Gannon had entered the water. Yet there was nothing untoward about Flower's appearance. He had no dust on his clothes and nothing unusual about his behavior. He stayed in the pub for about an hour, and then slept in the barracks, as we see, that night, waking to the very unpleasant duty of pulling a woman's corpse from the river. The evidence thus far disclosed was naturally sufficient for Henry Flower to be charged with the murder of Bridget Gannon. He then exercised his legal right to silence. Meanwhile, another witness contradicted Clowry, saying he had seen two couples in an apparent double dating mode on the night before the fatal night, whereas Clowry maintained that she was simply the gooseberry to Gannon and Flower. Called on this point, Margaret Clowry said that the witness to whom she had said goodnight must have been mistaken and must have thought that a passerby was her accompaniment. Next, there were two fishermen at the Dodder, close to where the railway signalman said he had recognized Flower with a tall girl. Angler Michael Moran said he instead saw two girls pass, not a man and a woman, but two girls, and, quote, one of them was the deceased, Bridget Gannon. He could not say who the other girl was. Moran said he saw the body the next morning as it was lifted out of the River Dodder, but did not tell anyone that he knew who it was, despite the policemen asking if anybody recognized the corpse. And he said this was because he did not want to be late for work. Now, the coroner was naturally skeptical at this point of the whole story of late night fishing and not volunteering information as to the identity of the remains. And he suggested Moran might have been angling to hook some porter. And yet, this witness was backed up by another, a lad who said he had been fishing with Moran. His name was Joseph Kinley, and he also saw two girls passing leisurely along. And when they were passing, Moran, his friend, said he knew one of them. He passed that remark to Kinley. So each of these two witnesses saw two girls rather than a man and a girl. This is contemporaneous corroboration. And yet when Margaret Clowry was called forward, Kinley, the young lad, said she was not one of the girls who passed, which tended to make all of this evidence unimportant. At least one man, and here he is, Timothy Harrington, recognized that the whole case against Henry Flower hung on the word of Margaret Clowry alone. Tim Harrington was a defense barrister. He had been engaged by Flower's defense solicitor, Gerald Byrne. And Byrne, incidentally, also defended the Invincibles over the Phoenix Park murders and Samuel Childs over the murder of his brother, both of which are significant cases which also feature prominently in Ulysses. In this case, Harrington observed, quote, "The girl Clowry showed that she was very keen in pressing the case against Constable Flower," unquote. He submitted, however, that her evidence was completely contradicted on nearly every point. He asked why she had been at a police barracks and had not mentioned from the very first that Flower had been out with Miss Gannon on the night she died, if that was really what happened. Meanwhile, the postman said he saw a girl sitting with a man on the Dodder bank at 10:15 p.m., yet it was shown that at that very time, Constable Flower was in Mr. Walsh's public house in Bath Street, a considerable distance away. Harrington suggested that there was nothing to justify going beyond the original verdict of simply found drowned. Nonetheless, the case was sent forward to a grand jury to see if it merited a full murder trial. Harrington made much of the fact that even if the constable had been out with her, which he did not for a moment grant, then Constable Flower had no motive to kill Bridget Gannon, whose body was unmarked. At this point in proceedings, the dead woman's sister, Annie Wogan, stood up in court and claimed Bridget had been defending her honour and that had caused her to die. So she was quickly hushed and the torn and the shredded flower found on the riverbank remained a mystery, but it was mute as to evidence. And as to whether it was murder, manslaughter, or accident, nobody suggested a suicide. In the end, the grand jury could find no true bill to send Henry Flower forward on trial of his life. The judge then called him forward and ordered that he be discharged from the dock. This former member of the Dublin Metropolitan Police tug-of-war team, from where his photograph came at the beginning, resigned from the force the very next day and promptly disappeared. Margaret Clowry is probably glimpsed thereafter in the 1901 census, which is free online, as a cook and a servant to a Church of Ireland family in Dublin, before she too is erased from history. She may have gone to America, at least for a time. We are left with Ulysses. The book deals much with doubtful murder charges and with persons being apparently wrongly condemned, including Bloom himself in Circe, when Martha Clifford makes an appearance denouncing him. Is there any reason to think Margaret Clowry might be a suspect in Gannon's murder? There is nothing to suggest that officialdom suspected it in 1900, despite Harrington's howls of protest. But she was unemployed at the time of the drowning, and an empty purse was found in the victim's effects. The medical men also thought Gannon to be unconscious when she entered the Dodder. They gave evidence that she had no water in her stomach, whereas the sentient, when drowning, ingested copiously. Joyce may have picked up this detail. After all, he writes of key-jumping Reuben J's son, quote, must have swallowed a good bellyful. And that story is told in the Dignam funeral carriage, which left from practically the bank of the River Dodder. It's another tale that involves immersion in a river of a person. It's the Liffey and Dodd R. Dodd R. Reuben J. Dodd Jr. Henry Flower's Dodder mystery went unsolved at the time. Indeed, it went unsolved until 2 decades after the publication of Ulysses, even if it was unscrambled then, which must be doubtful in itself, as we shall see. But is Martha Clifford, MC, actually Margaret Clowry in the great book, whether guilty or innocent? We shall see. All the scholarly focus in regard to Martha Clifford in Ulysses, I would argue, has been on the content of the letter sent by her to Bloom. Its text, its construction, its language, its mistakes are all endlessly interpreted for clues as to her identity. But let us remember that the challenge posed by Joyce was set in the form of an equation in Ithaca. Let HF be LB, let Henry Flower be Leopold Bloom, find MC. Let's look at that equation. Leopold Bloom is a fictitious character using a real name. Martha Clifford is a fictitious name, which should, for the purposes of balance, belong to a real character. That's the implication, essentially overlooked by scholars all these decades. Joyce portrays real Dubliners everywhere in his book. Why should he do a double fake? The very word equation implies balance. Mathematically, it means two algebraic expressions equal to one another. To have a fictitious character with a real alter ego, Bloom and Flower, in communication with a fictitious nom de plume used by a fictitious character, would be what Joyce elsewhere in Ulysses terms an unsatisfactory equation. Of course, the whole book is a fiction, but to search within it alone for a fictitious character using a fictitious name would seem incongruent, at least, with the fact of Henry Flower. No, the harmonious solution is to look for a real person, And Joyce is already pointing us to a real-life case. I will now contend that the surrounding context of Bloom's receipt of Martha Clifford's letter provides overlooked evidence that supports the candidature of Margaret Clowry. And this is because Martha Clifford in the book is generally overlain with death, crime, investigation, and yes, punishment. As Bloom initially heads to the post office to see if Martha has replied to his letter, he passes Nichols, the undertakers. This reminds him of the funeral he is to attend. Dare say Coney Kelleher bagged the job for O'Neill's, a rival funerary establishment to Nichols. But now he muses on the name Corney. Does it sound like anything? Corney, met her once in the park, in the dark. What a lark! Police tout. Her name and address she then told. Scholars have assumed it is Corney Kelleher who is the police tout, but I'll read it again. Corney met her once in the park, in the dark. What a lark! Police tout. Her name and address she then told. It would seem ambiguous, at least. Bloom arrives in Westland Row, takes out the Henry Flower card from his hat, which he will use in the post office to claim any reply, and then he reflects how hot it is. He thinks how nice it would be to float about in the Far East, a chap buoyed in the dead, see, can't sink if you tried, the weight of the body in the water. What body? In what water? It's now he crosses the road to the post office. No answer, probably. Went too far last time. Isn't this actually reminiscent of when a suspect breaks down under questioning and starts to confess? The first thing they usually say is, I went too far. But there is a reply. He collects Martha's letter and puts it in his pocket. He then reviews a poster of soldiers on parade. That must be why the women go after them, a uniform. And he soon thinks of other uniforms, like a fireman or a bobby, a policeman, in other words. Only now does he stroll out of the post office, and he hasn't even opened the letter yet. He now rips open the envelope in his pocket and draws forth the missive itself. There's something pinned on. Photo, perhaps? Hair? No. Bloom goes into Cumberland Street to read his letter, which he opens within his newspaper. Who does that? You can read a letter. Nobody's going to see your letter. Nobody's going to be able to read the words. It's excessive circumspection. He discovers that the strange thing that has been pinned to it is a flower with flattened petals. And then we have Martha's letter. I do wish I could punish you, naughty boy, etc. Who exactly wanted to punish Henry Flower? Bloom tore the flower gravely from its pinhole. He considers it could be a poison bouquet to strike him down. It has no odor. He sniffs it to check. And yet it is highly redolent of the flower torn from the costume of Bridget Gannon before she entered the Dodder. And thus, in an episode notably devoted to sweet aromas, scents, and perfume, as of the lotus and the yellow soap in Sweeney's, this correspondence has no good smell about it. Martha, of course, has perfume envy or olfactory jealousy. Do tell me, what kind of perfume does your wife use? This reminds me, at least, of a wife from Shakespeare, one who has the lines, all the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. And that is the bard's darkest lady, Lady Macbeth. And that line about Molly and the Dark Lady comes but a few pages earlier in this same episode, Lotus Eaters. Joyce reads the letter again, and once more he does so within the shield of the Freeman's Journal. Having read it all, he took it from the newspaper and put it back in his side pocket. But is this not Joyce speaking of the press coverage of the real-life Henry Flower case? Having read it all, he took it from the newspaper. Joyce took the facts and rearranged them. I wonder, did she write it herself, doing the indignant? A girl of good family like me, respectable character? Margaret Clary insisted in evidence at the inquests that she and the deceased were respectable girls. Bloom now sums up his letter from Margaret Clifford in just 3 words. Naughty boy, punish! Fingering still the letter in his pocket, he drew the pin out of it. A common pin, eh? He threw it on the road, out of her clothes somewhere. Pinned together. I see. Bloom has thrown it away, so it's certainly not going to be pinned on him at any rate. No roses without thorns. And next he recalls that Martha has complained in the letter of having a bad headache. He thinks, has her roses probably. Time of the month. Martha Clifford straight away linked to the shedding of blood. Bloom recalls 2 sluts he once saw singing a rhyme about Mary losing the pin of her drawers. That makes him think of, so he thinks of this musical Mary, and that makes him think of Martha and Mary from the Bible, who were visited by Jesus at dusk. And if you recall, the importance of that parable or story is that one is good and one is bad. We now have a scriptural trio of a single man, Jesus, and 2 women together one evening. Mysterious, writes Joyce. And these biblical women happen to be sisters of Lazarus. Bridget Gannon also rose from the grave, if only by exhumation. And she was actually exhumed twice, but that's another story. Lovely cool water is Bloom's following thought. Stone cold. Bloom's day is hot, just as there was a hot day in August 1900 when Bridget Gannon died. Then a sigh, silence, long, long rest. Going under the railway arch, he took out the envelope, tore it swiftly in shreds, and scattered them towards the road. The shreds fluttered away, sank in the dank air, a white flutter, then all sank. The word sank twice. Fluttering shreds. Margaret Clary said in evidence that the dahlia she found was flittered in pieces. She gathered them up and took them home. She kept those floral remains, a strange souvenir you might think, and she produced them at a court appearance. Presumably they were kept in an envelope, although this is not explicitly stated in press reports. You would have had to have been there to see. And James Joyce attended inquests. Bridget Gannon's housekeeper independently confirmed that she had bought flowers and that one of them was missing from the vase on the night she died. It was an aster, she said, not a dahlia. The policeman, I beg your pardon, the postman, remember him who had led Margaret Clary to the riverbank spot? He had thought it to be a carnation, which shows you the powers of observation of men. Bloom, meanwhile, has reread the letter, throwing in the names of many flowers among Martha's words. He does not mention any of the various flowers that pepper the actual Henry Flower case, a dahlia, carnation, aster. He instead cites tulips, violets, I want to do violets to your cactus, forget-me-not, and also night stalk. It's not a flower. Who might be stalked at night? And he mentions anemone, which is easily mispronounced as an enemy. Is Clary Clifford? We found that Bloom now wants his own immersion in water, a bath before the funeral. Indeed. And Bath also resonates with Bath Avenue, directly off of which the drowning happened, and Bath Street in Irishtown, where a flower went drinking on the fatal night. Bloom in Westland Row imagines a train disaster with Guinness barrels breached, a large, huge, dull flood, a lazy, pooling swirl of liquor bearing along wide-leaved flowers of its froth. He enters All Hallows Church as a shortcut back to Westland Row. A nice, discreet place to be next to some girl. He watches the women at Mass. Lord Cure, waters of oblivion. He imagines meeting Martha Clifford, flowing from this reminder of the biblical Martha and the cool pools of Bethany. Meet her one Sunday. Do not deny my request. Turn up with a veil and black bag, dusk and the light behind her. Did you catch the word veil? The veil is interesting. A newspaper drawing of Margaret Clowry shows her wearing a veil. I have never felt myself so much drawn to a man as you. When Martha Clifford appears in a dream sequence in Circe, we see her first as a veiled figure. But Bloom now ruminates in the church. She might be here with a ribbon round her neck and do the other thing all the same on the sly. Do what other thing? The immediate assumption is sex, of course. But the interior monologue continues. Do the other thing on the same, on the sly. Their character, that fellow that turned Queen's evidence on the Invincibles. He used to receive the, Carey was his name, the communion every morning. This very church. Peter Carey, yes. No, Peter Claver, I'm thinking of. Oh, Dennis Carey. Just imagine that, wife and 6 children at home and plotting that murder all the time. Plotting murder. Carey. No, Claver. No, Carey. Just don't mention Clary. Oh, no, she's not here, the flower. No. By the way, did I tear up that envelope? Yes, under the bridge. Under the bridge. A bridge is across a river, as one of the dull pupils tells Joyce's own alter ego, Stephen, early in the book during the Nestor episode. Gannon's body was recovered on a short stretch between Herbert Bridge at Lansdowne Road and Bath Avenue's London Bridge. The latter, London Bridge, is hard by Irishtown Station, where Henry Flower worked. Mass now ends in Lotus Eaters, and before leaving with his letter, Bloom muses on the dogma mystery, we might call it. More interesting if you understood what it was all about. Confession. Everyone wants to. Then I will tell you all. A line from Martha's letter. What could Martha possibly have to confess? Is it something she herself has done? A line in her letter says, I feel so bad about. Joyce, or Martha, doesn't go any further. What do you feel bad about, Martha? Spit it out, woman. Penance, punish me, please. Great weapon in their hand. More than a doctor or a solicitor. Woman dying too. That's Bloom thinking about the priest. And not women dying too, but singular. Woman dying too. Flowers, incense, women enjoy it. Only now the plural, mark you. Bloom goes out behind 2 worshippers who dipped furtive hands in the low tide of holy water. Tide, water again. Bloom goes for his bath after a trip to Sweeney's the chemist and a delay by Bantam Lines. As he finally escapes, Bloom envisions a gentle, tepid stream. This is my body. He foresaw his pale body reclined in it, a buoyed lightly upward, lemon yellow, his navel, bud of flesh, and saw the dark tangled curls of his bush floating hair of the stream around the limp father of thousands, a languid floating flower. So there's certainly lots in that episode about Henry Flower, sex, and immersion in water. And I would argue there are specific Bridget Gannon and Margaret Clowry references as well, all wrapped around the receipt and the reading of the Martha Clifford letter. At the funeral in the following episode, Hades, Bloom asked himself, did I write Ball's Bridge on the envelope I took to cover when she disturbed me writing to Martha? Hope it's not chucked in the dead letter office. So Molly was the person who disturbed him when he was writing, and he might have written Ball's Bridge by mistake. So there's death and Martha again. The dead letterbox is noted a few times in Ulysses. And the reason it could have gone to the dead letter office is that Bloom fears he actually wrote upon it the disguise of Ball's Bridge instead of Martha's actual reply address. But this is a disguise that is actually one of Joyce's disguised reveals. Margaret Clowry made her claim about Henry Flower being the last person seen with the dead woman to a constable in Ball's Bridge. In Nausicaa, Gertie McDowell, sometimes suggested as a Martha Clifford candidate, tells us why she couldn't be a suspect. She loathed that type of person, the fallen women off the accommodation walk beside the daughter that went with the soldiers, and coarse men with no respect for a girl's honour, degrading the sex and being taken up to the police station. This is a very clear reference to the Henry Flower case and the fallen women who fall or who are pushed. Gertie would never respond to a man seeking the assistance of a lady typist who signed himself as Bloom did with the notorious name of Henry Flower, a suspected killer. But Margaret Clowry might. There's unfinished business there. We meet Martha Clifford again when she appears as a veiled figure in Circe, as I said. Again, a newspaper illustration of Clowry shows her wearing a veil because, of course, she's in mourning for her friend, her drowned friend, Bridget Gannon. From Circe, Martha, thick-veiled, a crimson halter around her neck, a copy of the Irish Times in her hand, in a tone of reproach, pointing, Henry, Leopold, Lionel, thou lost one, clear my name. What's this crimson halter around her neck? Is that a noose for somebody? And why does Martha need to have her name cleared? Surely that's a matter for the heavily impugned Henry Flower, apart, of course, from the defence barrister's imputations against Margaret Clowry's evidence. Martha is carrying a copy of the Irish Times because Bloom placed the small ad there to attract his correspondent. Let's briefly look at the Lestrygonians episode. He passed the Irish Times. There might be other answers lying there. So there could be other answers lying there for the reader of Ulysses in the Irish Times coverage of the Henry Flower case. Like to answer them all, the replies. Small ads are a good system for criminals. Code. Indeed, it's code to the reader. Bloom thinks, oh, leave them there to simmer. Enough bother wading through 44 of them. Please notice the word wading. Wanted, smart lady typist to aid gentlemen in literary work. That was the small ad. Bloom recalls the other one, Lizzie Twigg, a real person who was a secretary to the poet George Russell and who was a minor figure herself in the Celtic revival. She seems to have replied to Bloom's ad, but only in fiction because she's a real person. Well, that's interesting in itself. People who respond to Bloom's ad are real people. The other one, Lizzie. In the Henry Flower case, there was another constable embroiled because he went out with a prostitute on that night. Her name was Lizzie. The other one, Lizzie Kavanagh. Best paper by long chalks for a small ad. thinks Bloom of the Irish Times. Cook and general, excellent cuisine, housemaid kept. A typical ad for a servant like Margaret Clary, who was also a cook, a fact mentioned in evidence. Respectable girl, or C, wishes to hear of post in fruit or pork shop. So the above small ad from the book also masquerades as an innocent seeking of an employee. Margaret Clary insisted that she and Gannon were respectable girls, don't forget. She might have been RC, but she's also a distinct candidate for MC. And the rest of it, post in a fruit or pork shop. Post can mean letters, of course, while Clary and Gannon went into a fruit shop and bought plums. And what respectable girl would work in a pork shop? Doesn't that sound rather like a brothel? In Lestrygonians, Bloom observes, those plainclothes men are always courting slavies, easily twig a man used to uniform. He soon thinks of the past, the early days of his marriage and the inability to recall time, like holding water in your hand. He thinks of Martha's letter. Are you not happy in your home, you poor little naughty boy? Adding, wants to sew on buttons for me. That's an interesting phrase. To sew on buttons is an Edwardian idiom meaning to set down at once what you want to remember. Otherwise, it might be forgotten. It blends Bloom's questions of recall, the ability to remember, but also the idea of a lady aiding a gentleman in literary work by taking down his bon mot and observations, dictation. Yet perhaps Martha is also the lady aiding gentleman Joyce in his literary work of adorning Ulysses by stitching in remembrance of the Henry Flower case. Finally, on this unimportant point, sewing is what prisoners do, of course. Sewing mailbags continued from Victorian times right up into the 1950s. So a question turns on whose responsibility it is to do any sewing or any time in this case. Bloom thinks he must answer Martha's letter, and eventually we come to Sirens in the Ormond Hotel and Bloom's reply. He has his paper already and he gets pen and ink from Pat, the Ormond Hotel waiter. But Bloom murmurs aloud some misleading words to throw nearby Richie Goulding off the scent to make it sound like he is answering a small ad himself for a job as a commercial rep. Bloom dipped, Bloomer, dear sir. He's half murmuring, dear sir, while actually writing, dear Martha. But this is a very obvious clue about Bloomer, dear, blue murder, or if you prefer, murder in the blue. The text of Bloom's reply is bland. Why did you call me naughty? And then he asks, are you naughty too? That might be quite important. Finishing up, he writes Martha's address on the envelope, but murmurs aloud for Richie Goulding's benefit, Messrs. Callan, Coleman and Co. Limited, as if answering an ordinary commercial ad. But he's just copied the names of the dead out of the paper beside him. Callan, Coleman, Dignam, Fawcett are all in the death notices of the freemen, as we've previously been told. So Martha Clifford is again, for the umpteenth time, associated with death. Bloom then uses blotting paper. We might think of the phrase blotting your copybook. And this gives him an idea for a tidbit story he could write. Something the detective read off the blotting pad. So we have death and a detective in the case. It's all relating to a death, a fatality, if not a homicide, and its investigation. And Bloom finally thinks, after writing his reply, one life is all, one body. He will go to the post office when he leaves the hotel. And then we come to Circe, the most turbulent and phantasmagorical episode of the whole lot. And I mention that when Martha Clifford appears in Circe, she is immediately confronted by a policeman. He says sternly, "Come to the station." This line is usually read as if aimed at Bloom, but Joyce is cunning. Margaret Clowry did go to the police station to accuse Henry Flower. What else? Well, Martha starts sobbing behind her veil. Next, she yells out, "Breach of promise! My real name is Peggy Griffin. He wrote to me that he was miserable. I'll tell me brother, the Bective Rugger fullback on you, you heartless flirt." So her real name is Peggy, is it? That's a diminutive of Margaret, like Margaret Clowry, whose surname, however, is not Griffin, but then Joyce also has to protect himself from libel after all. MG cannot be MC. But it turns out that the word Griffin, in my Collins dictionary, is slang for a betting tip or hint. Thus, the hint from Peggy Griffin as a whole is that her real first name is Margaret. And now we remember that "can you take a hint" is what Clowry alleged that Henry Flower told her when he wanted to be left alone with Gannon. And the Rugger, "I'll tell me my brother, the Bective fullback on you, you heartless." This is interesting. At one level, it's a deflection. And there was no Griffin who played fullback for Bective, nor any Clowry either. Yet it is at the same time highly revelatory. It's a typical Joycean double bluff. Bridget Gannon died directly across from the rugby stadium at Lansdowne Road, the home of Irish rugby then as today. The first international was played there as far back as 1878. Keep your eye on that chimney there, well, the chimney on the right-hand side. There it is today. To the left-hand side, we have the shadow of the Aviva Stadium. To the right hand, see the bridge, that's London Bridge, and then the chimney, which still stands. And now I mention a phrase from the book when Bloom first receives Martha's letter and thinks about meeting her. A usual love scrimmage. Usual love scrummage. Rugby. These references taken together are pointing us to Lansdowne Road and the very heart of the Henry Flower case. There's the death scene superimposed upon the modern photograph, and there we have on the right-hand side that chimney again. And then we're told that, of course, he doesn't play for Lansdowne. This is Margaret Clifford's brother in Circe, but for Bective, he's the Bective Rugger fullback. But Bective derives from Bec. It's a descriptor of Bec, which is an ancient word for stream, as in tooting Bec. Bective means streamy. So for the author of Ulysses to refer to the Lansdowne Rugger fullback would be too damn obvious. Joyce is forever almosting it. He went to two leading rugby schools, don't forget, Clongowes and Belvedere. He attended international rugby games when he lived in Paris, and he discussed rugby with visitors. He knows exactly what he is doing when he mentions scrummages and rugger in connection with Henry Flower's correspondent. So on his readers, he has deftly slotted over a conversion at Lansdowne Road from Margaret Clowry to Martha Clifford. Martha Clifford gives an address at Dolphin's Barn, of course, but it will be admitted that this is a blind. We know a dolphin's natural element, and in Homer's Odyssey, when the hero Ulysses, or beg your pardon, Ulysses, is shipwrecked, he is dramatically dolphin-born to the shores of Hades. And the Westland Row post office may actually parallel this as in an equation. It's west land, a place for those gone west, dead. We know Joyce uses this imagery at the famous, in his famous short story, the dead, when Gabriel Conroy is thinking of going west. And the Odyssey actually places Hades in the west. Meanwhile, Bloom considers in Nausicaa that Martha Clifford might be a false name, however, like my name, and the address Dolphin's Barn, a blind. What comes next is most telling. Her maiden name was Jemima Brown, and she lived with her mother in Irish town. Followed by, place made me think of that, I suppose. So Joyce has actually told you here, from one place to another. For Dolphin's Barn, read Irish town. The author has solved it, provided you read between the lines. Irish town was the police station of Henry Flower, and Bridget Gannon died in the Irish town bailiwick. Furthermore, the song Jemima Brown, a music hall number by one Harry Clifton, not Clifford, transfers the naughtiness of naughty boy Henry to the woman herself, who was first met, incidentally, at a railway station like Lansdowne. This is the chorus. I used to take her everywhere, to all the sights in town, and then she left me in despair, did naughty Jemima Brown, as naughty Margaret Clary did with Henry Flower. So I think I have satisfied a lot of references and allusions in the book as a prosecutor with a circumstantial case, but a strong case, I hope. You will be the judge. We must next briefly consider the portrayal of saints. Anyone who has read Ulysses knows that Joyce, the former prefect of the sodality of the Blessed Virgin Mary in Belvedere, is obsessed not only with fallen women, but with saints. He has already mentioned Saint Martha of Bethany in connection with Martha Clifford. She's the patron saint of homely and faithful housewives, which fits Joyce's overall theme. Saint Martha is usually depicted as carrying a jar of water with 3 keys on her girdle. Bridget Gannon's water-sodden body had that empty purse I told you about, and 3 small keys on a steel ring. There's one other oddity. St. Martha is usually portrayed, you can check all this afterwards, with a dragon. Don't ask me why, but there's another saint, and it's not St. George, another female saint who is depicted with a dragon, and you've guessed it, it's St. Margaret. So Martha equals Margaret, at least in hagiography. What about the surname Clifford? Joyce, like Charles Dickens, paid a lot of attention to names. Whole books have been devoted to his nomenclature. Cliff, ford. You fall from a cliff and a ford is over water. Just as the obtuse schoolboy told us in Nestor, a bridge is over water, sir. So not only is Henry Flower linked to the Henry Flower case, as he must be and as is inescapable, but Martha Clifford is linked to Henry Flower and must be plunged into it too, right up to her neck. We are approaching the end. The only word that sounds like cowrie in Ulysses is cowrie, a type of shell. Money cowries, says Joyce when describing Garrett Deasy's shell collection in Nestor, because cowries were used as money in certain South Sea islands. Money then, is that a motive? The empty purse. Margaret Clary unemployed at the time, yet needing to find her rent because she was living in lodgings. The magazine Retired Garda, yes, there is a magazine, Retired Garda, wrote of the Henry Flower case in 2007. It concluded, 40 years later, there was a deathbed confession by an old lady that met Bridget Gannon. Her name was Margaret Clary. She said that after Constable Flower had left her, she had a quarrel with Bridget Gannon, pushed her into the river, Gannon drowned, and then she took her cash. The well-known late Joycean and Supreme Court Judge Adrian Hardiman had no such difficulty in recording this tittle-tattle in his 2017 book, Joyce in Court, although he did not equate her to Martha Clifford. Hardiman wrote, Flower may have been innocent all along, The distinguished, if maverick, Joycean scholar and leading Dublin civil servant John Garvin records that in the 1940s, a gravely ill woman in a Dublin tenement, on the advice of a priest attending her, sent for a solicitor to whom she made a dying declaration in relation to the death of Bridget Gannon. She was Margaret Clowry, the woman who first drew suspicion on Flower. She said that she had met Bridget Gannon after Flower had left her and quarrelled with her, Gannon, about money which was in her possession. She said she had purloined her cash and pushed the woman into the river. As it happens, the solicitor to whom the dying woman made this declaration was John Cusack, a son of Michael Cusack, a prominent late 19th century nationalist and founder of the GAA, who was the prototype for the citizen in the Cyclops episode of Ulysses. When preparing this accusation of Margaret Clowry as making up most of Martha Clifford, if not all, I naturally Googled both names together, Margaret Clowry and Martha Clifford, to see if anyone had beaten me to it. Only one item popped up, a single solitary reference. It was a letter from the writer Brendan Behan, a man not unfamiliar with Dublin's demi-monde, I think you'll agree, to the Evening Herald, dated the 26th of November 1957, in response to an article they had published on the real-life factual Henry Flower case. Behan pointed out that Henry Flower was one of the aliases, that James Joyce gave to Leopold Bloom in the latter's love letters in Ulysses. Joyce also used the initials of the witness, Bridget Gannon's friend, Margaret Clowry. Being quoted from Ithaca, "What object did Bloom add to the collection of objects? A fourth typewritten letter received by Henry Flower, let HF be LB, from Martha Clifford. Find MC. Find MC. I think she is found. Through the newspaper references to which we are pointed by the author, and through the shoals of Joyce's own pages in Ulysses, all dripping with clues and allusion. It was never just about the contents of her letter. Joyce is ever too artful for that. And so the prosecution puts it plainly to you, the jury. Martha Clifford, substantially, is Margaret Clowry. She's unveiled. Thank you very much.
Well done, Senan. Thank you so much. That was amazing and lots of fun. And if you are ready, we have a few questions. Mary Nell Murphy had pointed out in the chat that about Brendan Behan's letter, so I was on the cusp of asking you about that.
Just as well I fessed up to that one then.
Yeah, phew. And Helen Millington is in awe of your research, but she wanted to know if you believe Joyce's works insist on exegetical engagement, and do you believe that there's an inherent desire when reading Joyce to find the keys to understanding the complexities? Always, I suppose, an intrinsic game of cat and mouse between author and reader.
That's a very erudite question.
That's Helen for you. Thanks, Helen.
I think Ulysses is rather like the Arc de Triomphe insofar as it's placed at the Place de l'Étoile in Paris, and there are many avenues leading off. And I'm afraid the academics only go down certain avenues. I would think, for instance, that they have tended to look for a fictional identity to Martha Clifford, self-contained within the book, because for decades they have been living outside of Dublin, the main international scholars, and they don't have anything else. But what perhaps they fail to appreciate is that Joyce had no idea when he was writing the book that he was going to become a modernist icon. His previous book was Dubliners, presumably aimed at Dubliners, and perhaps he thought that he was having fun with a Dublin readership initially, and that they would have fun finding MC, and they could if they read between the lines and looked up the newspapers and so on. the question of exegesis in the book is very interesting. I mean, I think the book has plenty of secrets left to tell us, and I really do believe that some of these apparently random associations that Leopold Bloom makes, as I set out in my talk, are not random at all. They are seen as a triumph of modernism, you know, on one level, on a surface level, in the same way as you know, let's say another modernist writes a book about somebody getting on the tram and describes in great detail the green ticket they received from the conductor and the number that was on it. People would say that, oh, that's very ordinary, it's very everyday, that's very modernist. So Joyce is doing that, but he's also doing some subterranean stuff. Like, the amazing thing about Joyce is, yes, he rewrites the novel completely from top to bottom. It's no longer chronological. He's enabled us, you know, to have movies like Pulp Fiction because everything is slashed and mashed up. And he does extraordinary things with a lack of punctuation and finishing sentences without finishing the sentence. And, you know, he does imagery, he does all the usual stuff. He does everything excellently. And yet there is symbolism as well. These are not stray details. You can find many, many layers. I sometimes compare Ulysses, not just to the Arc de Triomphe, but to the Paris metro running beneath, because there's plenty of lines going in all kinds of directions. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's my overall.
We have another question from Pierce McCaughey, and he is interested in the connection between the Clifford case and the slavey working girl in Two Gallants from
Yes.
Dubliners, just what you're describing there.
Yes.
And that she worked as a servant off Baggot Street.
Correct.
Went, as Corley admits, he went for a walk round by the canal, and she told me she was a slavey in a house in Baggot Street.
He's spot on. He's absolutely spot on. There are flower case similarities with Two Gallants. Perhaps Joyce was experimenting initially before transferring it to Ulysses, and you know, he imports many of the characters of Dubliners into Ulysses. Why shouldn't he import some of the crimes that are alluded to in Ulysses from Dubliners as well? Bridget Gannon was a well-built girl, a slavey who was working in a house in Baggot Street, and Corley goes out with a well-built slavey. That's true. Furthermore, the slavey, when she meets Corley in Two Gallants, is wearing a white sailor hat. And on the night she disappeared, Bridget Gannon was wearing a white sailor hat. The slavey, furthermore, wears in Two Gallants, wears a big bunch of red flowers pinned on her bosom in the short story. And Bridget Gannon wore that flower on the exterior of her costume, presumably pinned in the same way as the flower is pinned to the letter that he receives from Martha Clifford. Furthermore, Corley is said to have the gait of a policeman in Two Gallants. He is burly, described as burly-like flower, and he's the son of a police inspector. He is, I've just printed out a few lines from Two Gallants. He's often to be seen walking with policemen in plain clothes, talking earnestly. Corley knew the inner side of all affairs. And at the end of the story, of course, with Two Gallants, we have Corley producing the bright golden sovereign, which shows that the slavey has been recklessly or ruthlessly exploited for money, which is the same with the, if you believe the Margaret Clary confession from the 1940s, there was a money motive in pushing her into the river. Now, I have to say, I looked into that, and I cannot find any basis for, you know, certain belief that that is true. That is hearsay story about the woman confessing in the 1940s. I foolishly looked through all the Margarets that died in Dublin around that time, and I cannot say that that any of them would fit Margaret Clary. Of course, she could have married and had a different name and so on, but even so, it's hard to tie that story down.
There's another question from James Keeley, and this is following some questions about where the burial is. Margaret Clary, Patrick Courtney thinks she's buried in Clonsilla graveyard. But James is asking, first he says fascinating paper, Senan. Thank you very much. But it raises another question. If conclusive proof came out only after Joyce's death, with Clowry's deathbed confession, how do you think Joyce knew the murderer, even as the murderer's identity eluded the authorities for all those years? Would you have any thoughts on
No,
that?
that's a very good question, and I'm very grateful for it again. I suspect myself, I have no proof of this, that the connection is the defense solicitor, Gerald Byrne. It's an extraordinary coincidence that Gerald Byrne was the defense solicitor in the case of the Invincibles back in 1883. He was also the defense solicitor in 1899 for Samuel Childs, when he was accused of the murder of his brother Thomas Childs at Bengal Terrace, which also features in Ulysses. And then, of course, we have the Flower case the next year, 1900, which further features in Ulysses. So all these three notorious cases, assassination, if you like, and two murders, involve one defense solicitor. So perhaps that defense solicitor was a bit garrulous, or he was a friend of Simon Dedalus. In other words, John Stanislaus Joyce. And, he was a bit loquacious in his cups, perhaps. I mean, I would think that looks to me like the source of some of this accounts of, perhaps Byrne, doubted his client's innocence in the case of Samuel Childs, and doubted whether Margaret Clowry was on the level.
So I'm interested in the young Joyce attending these court cases. I always think that he wandered around Dublin because he really didn't want to go home. Home wasn't a great place to go, but perhaps he is attending or interested in these court cases because of this celebrity solicitor, or because of the connection with his father, that it's not just somewhere to go as a, not wanting to go home, wandering. He actually was totally curious
nice and
of
warm.
this guy in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think Joyce got a taste for it early on. He was 17 when his great uncle, a Giltrap, died on Bengal Terrace, and that was only 2 days before. No, it was only the day before the murder of Thomas Childs. And so Joyce was right there. He was around that exact terrace, and he got the police were going house to house and all the rest of it, and he attended the inquest. So the inquest was held in the Brian Boru pub. Joyce is there, and then Joyce subsequently, the following year, in relation to the Henry Flower case, he wangles a pass for the duration of the Henry Flower proceedings in Green Street. And I also have determined that he attended inquests in Sandymount. One of the Gannon inquest was held in Sandymount, and I found one or two other indications that of Joyce attending Sandymount inquests. I won't go into.
Another question from Vincent Altman O'Connor. Senan's theory on Martha Clifford is by far the most convincing to date. Even after 100 years, readers are still at the mercy of the sudden emergence of a hitherto undocumented fact. Michael Begnall in 1976 suggested that Martha Clifford was a Manon other than the journalist Ignatius Fred Gallagher. As a journalist, what is Senan's opinion of Bagnall's theory?
Yeah, I'm actually familiar with that. I read that piece. I mean, and he gets that. He gets that by literally following the equation of let HF be LB, find MC. So he counts down 4 letters from H to L, and he counts up 4 letters from F to B to get LB. So let HF be LB, and then he applies that to Martha Clifford, find Martha Clifford, and when he goes 4 down and 4 up, he gets QY, and he doesn't like that. So he does the inverse. He does the mirror image. He counts 4 up and 4 down, and he gets IG for Ignatius Gallagher. If that held true, surely the first thing you would do would be go to the UP postcard and do the same there. And I've done that. I'm a sad case. And that comes out with the YL and QT. So I think it's a pretty flimsy argument.
We just have a few more, Senan, and we should probably end soon. This could go on all night, but it's so much fun. So Des Gunning has queried, wouldn't Joyce have had access to a certain insider intel through his association with the medicals who had a role around autopsies and inquests?
Yeah, that goes to the question of where did Joyce get his information. That's yes. I mean, he probably would have heard some rumor from our friend Oliver St. John Gogarty on the fringes of all that. Funnily enough, only last week I was sent a file from the National Archives involving medical attendance on in the Henry Flower case and the examination of clothes and so on. Unfortunately, somebody has been into National Archives and has stolen the most important of the Henry Flower case files. They no longer exist.
Oh,
but I think it is very interesting that the rumor has persisted through. You can place a good deal of regard, I think, in sort of the grey, outside the black and white, sort of the grey area of Dublin rumour, where people are talking to each other in pubs, and Brendan Behan having the word let out there, about that Margaret Clary, as somebody pointed out earlier.
John O'Reilly's just talking about Bective Rugby Club, that his school friends Billy Fallon and Eugene and Richard Sheehy were members. And the club is also mentioned in Portrait. And two other members, Paddy Rath and James McGee. And the Colopy brothers, who played for Bective and Ireland, are mentioned in Finnegan's Wake. So yeah, that's John O'Reilly saying well done for all your rugby references there.
Yay.
Maybe he's missing going to matches. Are you,
yeah,
John?
I hope he's as glued to the Six Nations, or the Six Nations as I call them now in the current climate. Of course, Joyce was more interested in cricket. He was he liked his pick, pack, pock. But I think he liked rugby as well. Fair play to him.
Yeah, we should probably finish up. I just want to say a huge thank you to you, Senan, and to John Gunning, our technical support this evening. It was extremely seamless. Yeah, you're getting great praise, Senan, that it was just excellent and lots of food for thought. And people really enjoyed it. I'm afraid we had a limit, which I didn't expect, of only 100 people. So a few people didn't get to see it. So I'm going to, I'm recording the lecture, and I can send it on to you all for those who attended to watch again. And for those, I'm terribly sorry for those who weren't able to join us. And I can send on the recording. Maybe without me singing on it.
That was the best bit. The best bit.
Oh no. Okay, I have been known to break into song of an evening. Yeah, so thank you again. So thank you to the James Joyce Centre for all the work it's doing, and keeping this wonderful Joycing experience alive. And yeah, so we'll have a few more in this spring lecture series. Terence Killeen is next with a celebration commemoration of George Clancy on the 100th anniversary of his tragic death. So that will be in March. So looking forward to have you all back, and I'll make sure that the limit is increased. I thought it was up to 300, but maybe the magic of Zoom just didn't let that happen this evening. So terribly sorry for those who couldn't make it. Thank you again for joining. I'm so glad you enjoyed it, and we'll do lots more of these events. Thanks again. Bye.